I would think the number one thing that would be considered, I guess, heresy, and this would be globally, very few countries are not participating in policy like this, is free money, is helicopter money. Because no matter your political views, no matter your views on economics or monetary policy or fiscal policy, it's very difficult to get a check in the mail and look at that and say, this is a bad thing that I'm getting this check in the mail.
Welcome to the Gold Republic Podcast. My name is Bart Brands.
And I'm Alexei Jordanov. In our weekly podcast, we invite guests from all over the world to get valuable insights
into the emergence of a new monetary system through the lens of precious metals, cryptocurrencies, and other financial instruments.
Welcome to the Gold Republic Podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of welcoming Joe Brown. Joe Brown has been a person that we have actually followed since a while. We've seen his channel grow tremendously over the past year. I think the first time I watched your videos, you were approximately like just about 10K followers, I think. And by now you're almost reaching the 100,000K. So really congrats on that. And also it's not surprising. You deliver quality content, always on point, very regularly, almost every day. You also have top-notch interviews, and you explain difficult topics that are related to finance or also the monetary system in a quite understandable manner, which I think also gives value to people and educates them properly. So the name of your channel is Heresy Financial. So first, why did you create this channel? And maybe before that, answering that question, what is kind of your background that led you to actually the point where you created this company and also educating people through your channel?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's been really fun to see. When I first started, I didn't realize, or I wasn't sure that there was going to be, there were enough people out there that were interested in these things to make, an entire YouTube channel dedicated to it and other things like that. So it's been a real pleasure seeing that there's, interest out there and people learning about what goes on behind the curtain and the Federal Reserve, monetary policy, economics, and investing and things like that. So the background is when I first got married, I was like $30,000 in debt, which was mostly student loans. So by today's standards, that's not a ton. But for me, it was a ton, earning minimum wage, and just realized that I had to kind of dig myself out of the hole that I had put myself in. And so my wife and I buckled down and kind of did the classic debt snowball, ate beans and rice for, a year while we paid that off. And that just really sparked my interest in learning about investing and money, and set me down that path. And shortly after, I got a job as a stockbroker, and spent a couple years in the financial services industry, just moving around from job to job, just trying to learn everything I could about the whole industry from every side, every angle that I could. And the more that I learned, the more I realized, hey, I need to start, approaching this from kind of like a self-study angle, because a lot of times financial advisors, investment advisors, stockbrokers, they're all they get is what's fed to them from the top down. So a good example is like you ask your stockbroker or your financial advisor, hey, what's the most safest investment or most conservative investment? It's going to be your government's bonds 100% of the time. Okay, so where do they get their legal ability to provide you that advice? Ultimately, it comes straight from the government. And where do those rules come from on what they are allowed to say is aggressive versus conservative or anything like that? Again, that's through the licensing procedures. That's through the continuing education that comes straight down from the top. So at the very least, there's a little bit of a conflict of interest there from that standpoint. And then also the way that they're incentivized, basically. And so I started to study how money works and economics, basically just by reading books, on the side on my own that I had found or chosen or heard about, and realized that there's a whole nother world about how things work, and the the things that the financial services industry is getting fed is really not accurate in the way of how things work. And so after a while, it kind of just got to a point where I couldn't really, in good conscience, continue to do what I was doing. And so that's when I decided to start my channel. I think it was a little over 2 years ago now. And the last year or so has been, if you go back and watch any videos or look at anything I produced before like a year ago, it's probably not gonna sound the same or look the same. I've gotten a lot more dialed in on what to talk about and how to do things and what people are interested in learning about over the last year. But that's kind of the story behind it. And the name, for the second part of your question, heresy, is the definition of heresy is an opinion that is profoundly at odds with what is generally accepted. And so what I'm talking about, whether you are looking at mainstream media, whether you're talking to a financial advisor, whether you're talking to most people in the investment space that are talking about stocks or economics in the news, much of what I say would be considered heresy. Now, that doesn't mean I'm the only one doing it. There's plenty of people who are out there, proclaiming the truth and talking about the way things really work, and that are also kind of considered heretics by the mainstream standards. But that's kind of the idea behind the name there.
That makes total sense. So what is the biggest heresy at the moment that is at odds of what we see currently? I mean, we're in a really particular setting right now. We have historically low government bonds. We have rising inflation. We have record-breaking global debt, and also just in general government spending. How do you resume in a nutshell to someone who is not that savvy in just following what's happening, because it's also a very complex system, what is happening and how to make sense of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I would think the number one thing that would be considered, I guess, heresy, and this would be globally, very few countries are not participating in policy like this, is free money, is helicopter money. Because no matter your political views, no matter your views on economics or monetary policy or fiscal policy, it's very difficult to get a check in the mail and look at that and say, this is a bad thing that I'm getting this check in the mail. So if your monetary policy or fiscal policy views are, that's a good thing for the economy to bail out, 50% of Americans because they're, not able to get a job or not able to get paid what they need to get paid in order to make ends meet. They're obviously going to look at that and say, this is fantastic. I needed this. And they probably do short term. But even people who are looking at it from more of a free markets viewpoint and saying it's bad if the government does helicopter money, it's bad if the government bails out businesses that should be they should be letting just fail. It's still very difficult to have the view that, this check that I just got is bad. The reason, the main thing that you have to, the way you have to look at it is, if you get $1 from the government, it will cost you $2 in terms of your cost of living. So this month it will help. Over the next year, you're going to be worse off. And that's true whether or not the entire stimulus check, let's say, went to helicopter money or not. And we know they don't, because, if they pass a bill for $1 trillion, let's say 300 billion of it goes to people. The rest of it goes to, corporations and organizations and politicians' pockets and things like that. But even if the whole thing went to people's pockets, all of that new money entering the system, chasing after the same number of goods and services, will increase demand with a steady level of supply. And that's going to make it harder to get your hands on those things. And that the way that shows up is prices going up. And so that's the main thing that is probably everybody is saying, yes, give me more money. and not recognizing that it's making everybody worse off long term.
So we've seen, of course, because the same amount of goods, more money chasing after the same amount of goods and services is made possible by the Federal Reserve, or in Europe, European Central Bank. And they've turned what we've seen, for example, the last 10 years, roughly, is that unconventional methods or tools were provided to, because we were in all that time in a form of a crisis, and people said, well, we need these unconventional tools. But these unconventional tools have become conventional. And my question would be, can we conclude that it is a signal of structural problems in the economy, and can they be solved, and if they can be solved, how? Or can they not be solved, and are we just kicking the can down the road?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the idea of kicking the can down the road always begs the question, how far can you kick it? And we've been kicking it for decades now. So why are you assuming that road is going to come to an end anytime soon? So I think that one of the biggest things that you need to understand to kind of compare conventional tools versus unconventional tools, there's different kinds of money. So if the Federal Reserve or any central bank prints, let's say they triple the money supply, and then let's say they actually print it physically, but they put it on one of Elon Musk's rockets and send it off to Mars, and it lands on Mars. That doesn't increase the money supply, right? And everybody understands this. So there has to be some level of circulation going on with that new money that's been created in order for that to be considered an increase in the money supply. And so back 12 years ago, in the resolution of the great financial crisis, when all the central banks around the world were figuring out how do we prevent systemic collapse, what they were doing was not increasing the money supply that was in regular circulation. And I'll call that broad money supply, because I know you guys have talked to Lynn Alden, and this is something that she talks about quite a lot. That would be broad money supply, money that enters our bank accounts, and that we go spend on groceries and shoes and gas. What they were doing for the most part was increasing base money. And base money is the money for the banks, let's say. And that is the pool of money that allows the broad money supply to be increased. It doesn't cause it to be increased, but it allows it to be increased. And the reason why central banks were doing that is because that base money had been collapsing, because they thought that base money supply was, let's say, 100% of what they thought it was. And really, let's say 70% of that was mortgage-backed securities or derivatives of mortgage-backed securities. And so when everybody looked into the value of that base money, they realized, oh, it's actually 30% of what it was. And I don't know the exact, I'm just using that as an example, but the money they thought was there wasn't there. And if banks don't have the right amount of base money, well, then they collapse. Can't get overnight funding. They don't have the collateral requirements, all of that. And so central banks around the world stepped in and said, we're just going to refill your coffers of your base money. And that would allow you to continue expanding broad money supply through lending. But many of them didn't. And so the total amount of money that was actually in circulation didn't change that much. And that's why we didn't see, hyperinflation like many people were saying that we were going to see as a result of that. Now what is being done is over the last year and a half, we haven't been increasing broad money supply. Base money supply. And before I move on, I need to mention Japan, because you mentioned Japan. Everybody looks at Japan and says, hey, Japan has been printing money for decades, and they've had no inflation, so we can do the same thing. They've been doing the same thing that everybody did 12 years ago. They've been increasing the base money supply. They've been trying to cause their banks to cause inflation, but at the same time, individuals and corporations in Japan have been deleveraging. So there's been an offsetting forces there that the total broad money supply in Japan over the last 20 or 30 years has increased far slower than many countries, especially the United States. And so they haven't been printing money. That's a false narrative. Now what has been being done over the last, let's say, 2 years almost 2 years, is increasing the broad money supply, because they realized the lesson from 12 years ago. If you just increase the base money supply, you can't rely on the banks in hard times to go out and lend. You also can't rely on people to borrow. So it's a two-way street there. And so bank lending has not been exploding over the last year and a half. And so what they've done is fiscal policies from governments, monetary policies from central banks. What they've done is coordinated the two, and they've said, okay, if the banks aren't going to use their base money supply to expand the broad money supply, we'll just go around the banking system and spend money into existence. So we'll have fiscal policy, which is borrowing trillions of dollars and have governments spend a bunch of money. And since they can't borrow or tax that money from the economy, or else all you're doing is moving money from one location to another in the economy, that's not expanding. If you're borrowing from Grandma Sue and giving that out to your poor neighbor down the street, that's not expanding the money supply. That's moving dollars from one place to another. And so they've had governments spend money that they didn't borrow out of the economy. They borrowed from somebody, and they borrowed from the central bank. The central bank had to print that money into existence. So they've had to do deficit spending in excess of what they borrowed out of the economy. That is debt monetization. That's the central bank printing that money in order to lend to the government so the government can spend that out into the economy. And they've been spending that directly into the pockets of the people who will go out and spend that themselves. And so that's why we've been seeing record-breaking inflation right now. Because it's a different action than they took 12 years ago, and they've taken over the past. And then the final part of the question is kicking the can down the road. How long can this last? Well, if we look back at the last 30 years, due to the dollar being the global reserve currency, I know I'm talking about America mostly here, but that's because everything kind of like sits on top of that. If you look at interest rates over the last since 1980, long term, all they've done is trend down. And every time they hit zero or hit their low point, at some point the economy gets stronger, and the central banks will start to raise rates again, but they can never raise them back to the point at what they were before the last drop. And at some point they hit that trend line, and then they have to drop back down again. And that trend line is approaching zero here, and so if they do start to tighten again, they announce that today, or start in November or maybe January, they don't have as much room to do that as they did before. And last time they didn't have as much room to do that as they did before. And so eventually you're approaching zero on the move up. And so as far as how far can you kick the can down the road, that's a limitation there. And then the other thing is, every time they have to drop it and do new printing or new easing, you have to do it exponentially more than you did the last time, because the last time you did it, you solved the problems for the crisis this time. So you have to compensate for everything you caused last time and everything that's happening right now. And so the solution has to be bigger, and the room to do it becomes smaller.
So, Joe, that would be a very good explanation of why the U.S. debt level rose from, let's say, 10 trillion about 5 to 6 years ago to $30 trillion right now.
Yeah, exactly. And you would expect to see that if you were going to kind of go back and test that theory, you'd go back and see, well, have they then exponentially increased the amount of stimulus or help or easing? And that would be you'd have to look at the national debt, because a lot of that has been monetized. You'd have to look at the central bank's balance sheets, because that's where a lot of it has gone, and you'd be missing some. And so you'd say, okay, well, where did the rest of it go? And specifically in the case of America, one of the advantages of having the global reserve currency is that it gives you the ability to abuse that position, at least for some time. And a lot of the world has absorbed a lot of those dollars that have been created. One of the mechanisms for that is trade deficits. And so Americans have been sending dollars overseas for a very long time. The rest of the world has been using those dollars. And and so that gives a buffer for the central bank in America to be able to engage in much more aggressive, easy monetary policy, because a lot of these dollars are leaving our system. And so they're not having the same effect as they would on our system as, look at what's happening in Lebanon right now. Look at what happened in Venezuela over the last couple of years. Look at what's happening in Nigeria. Look at what's happening in a lot of these countries that don't have the same capabilities, but are engaging in, to a further extent, but similar types of monetary policies. These are little signs of what happens to countries as they do this. And if you have the global reserve currency, you can just carry it on a little bit longer than people would expect.
Mm-hmm. And there's also like other unconventional tools that become, let's say, or that come into the minds of people, or that actually already been doing. The central bank has been already done yield curve control, pushing down the yield of the government bonds. We've also seen the possibility of purchasing even stocks straight from the stock market. That's also a possibility to make sure that non-performing stocks are actually, as we see right now in China with Evergrande or other cases, the possibility of bailing out companies. But there's also the other possibility of negative interest rate. And this is now in the case of the Fed. The ECB, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan are already doing it. The ECB is currently at minus 0.25 of the policy rate, which is basically how much money, or the deposit rate, how much it costs for people to actually deposit money at the central bank. So the borrower actually is rewarded and saver is not. What do you think that even though Jay Powell was very explicit and all members of the Fed committee expressed that they would be highly against a negative interest rate, that there might be a scenario unfolding that could actually lead the Fed to actually not even flirt with the zero bound level, but go below it? And what kind of scenario would that be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's three parts that we got: yield curve control, purchasing stocks, and negative interest rates. I'll do in reverse order here. Negative interest rates are possible around the world specifically because they are not the global reserve currencies. It's not possible with the dollar. If they did that, it would kind of break the system. It doesn't work. Everybody else can do it because they're sitting on top of the dollar. Further than that, they don't need to, because nominal rates being negative are not necessary when you can force real rates to be negative. And that's all they care about. They need to make sure that, number one, the government doesn't go bust. And number two, most corporations don't go bust. They don't care about households. And so if you have government with $30 trillion of debt, and it's being rolled over at 3 or 4% interest on average, well, then what you need to do is be able to print enough money and get that into the government's hands through borrowing, and absorb most of that debt and keep interest rates low enough to where their cost of servicing that debt stays the same or goes down over time, regardless of how much debt they actually have. And so you would need their interest rates to hit 2% and then 1% and then 0%, and you can do that a number of ways. So if the Federal Reserve they absorb the debt, that debt becomes interest free for the government, because all profits at the central bank are swept back to the treasury of the central government. And so after they cover their costs and expenses, so it's basically free debt for the government. So the larger the balance sheet gets for the central bank, the cheaper servicing the debt becomes for the central government. And they still have a substantial amount of debt at higher interest rates from the past. So as that gets rolled forward into the new interest rates, their debt service costs actually go down, even if their total debt amount goes up. And then the same thing happens for the corporations in the country as well. As their debt service costs go down, many times their total debt load is actually going up. And so you can do that without hitting negative interest rates from a nominal side, as long as interest rates are negative from a real side, because costs of other things are going up. And so that means your incomes are going up faster than your cost of servicing the debt. And that is, we see that if you look at the total federal tax receipts for the United States government, 2020 was a record year in terms of how much they made in taxes. 2021 is dramatically more than 2020. And and they haven't raised taxes. They haven't raised tax rates, but prices of everything has been going up. And so even with tax rates staying the same, the government's income goes up. So it doesn't matter if they had to increase their debt in order to cause that to happen, because their income is going up more than their expenses.
That's
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, but that's hold on. Maybe you actually continue what you were saying, but that's a great point. Like basically the balancing between the prices of goods and then the taxes that they basically are not adjusted based on the inflation, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. And so people's incomes are going up. People's capital gains are going up because their asset prices are going up. You have taxes on goods and services that are making their way into government coffers, and so because prices of everything are going up, well, by nature, then the dollar amount that the governments are receiving in taxes are going up without having to increase your percentage that you're taking on those transactions. And so the price is going up as a direct result of spending all that money into the economy, which you had to borrow in order to do that. But to the extent that you're borrowing from your central bank, that debt is free. And so eventually you're a snake eating your tail as a government doing this, because eventually you get to a point where you've burned up your entire road. You can't move forward anymore. And you're either facing hyperinflation or a deflationary death spiral because you've used up all the resources in the economy. But that's the game that's being played right now, instead of negative interest rates from the American side. Now, there were two other parts of the question: purchasing stocks and yield curve control. So purchasing stocks, Japan has been doing for a while. The thing about that is that it'll probably be put into use. One of two ways it can happen in America, because it's technically illegal for the Federal Reserve to do that. So number one, they could do that through setting up special purpose vehicles at the Treasury, like they did to purchase corporate bonds, because that's something the Federal Reserve purchased corporate bonds, but they're not allowed to do that themselves. So they had to give money to the Treasury and have the Treasury do it. So they could do it that way. That's even further, though, stepping outside of their legal boundaries than what they did with corporate bonds. And so what might have to happen is they might have to have Congress make an amendment to the Federal Reserve Act in order to allow them to do that. So if we get to a point where there's a catalyst, stocks start to fall globally, 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%, and they start to buy up all of the debt. They start to print all the money. They start to mail out checks, and it's not causing a stall in the prices of assets falling. That's when they would have to resort to actually purchasing those assets themselves. And so that's when they would seek an amendment for the Federal Reserve Act to do that. The problem with something like that is what you face with, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the story of John Law and the Mississippi bubble in France 300 years ago.
Yes.
Long story short, for anybody who's not familiar, basically he got the charter for the central bank. He took all the gold and silver out of circulation and printed paper notes instead. He backed up that paper money with land in America. That's the Mississippi Company, his company. Well, he had to print a lot of money to do all the stuff that he wanted to do to try and grow the French economy. And so there was the risk of that devaluing the currency. So in order to back up that currency, in order to keep its value, he backed it up with the land from his with the shares from the land from the Mississippi Company. And now you face, okay, well, what happens if that land, those shares start to fall? So what he did was he printed money to purchase those shares, and so that they were both keeping each other afloat. It was like two lifeboats with holes that were, I'm scooping water from one into the other, and then from that one into the other one, and so some people caught on to this and realized the shares aren't worth what they say they're worth because they're purchased with paper money that can be printed out of thin air. The paper money is not worth what they say it's worth because it's only held up by those shares that are being held up by the paper money. And so that means you have an artificially high price of something, that the fair value is much lower absent the intervention. That means that if you are able to sell that thing, you get far more money for it, far more purchasing power for it than if you hold on to it, than you should get at fair value. And so it actually, by artificially increasing the value of something, you incentivize further selling, which necessitates further intervention to keep those prices even higher. And so kind of a similar thing to what many people say is happening with gold right now, that central banks and bullion banks are artificially keeping the price low. Well, if that, to the extent that that is true, and I believe there's, at least substantial, a little bit of that is real and going on right now because the short interest is so high. To the extent that that is happening, you are literally buying gold at a discount. That way, that absent the intervention, the gold price would be much higher. And so should the central banks around the world step in and start buying stocks, that incentivizes selling, because you're able to sell them at a higher price than you would be able to absent that intervention. And the more selling that occurs, then the more buying by central banks has to take place in order to keep those prices high. And so that's a last ditch resort. Most central banks won't want to engage in that behavior because they know it's something you can't really stop once you start. The last thing is yield curve control. The Federal Reserve at least hasn't engaged in outright yield curve control, and that is probably the next step of this because similar to purchasing stocks, they've been purchasing bonds. That keeps bond prices higher than they would be absent that intervention, which is the express purpose of it, to keep interest rates lower, to keep the economy rolling forward. And so they try to do that by just purchasing the short end of the curve, purchasing that shorter end debt. But should you have a catalyst that would start making the dollar drop, everybody starts shedding treasuries and dollars from around the world, then you'd have to engage in more outright yield curve control in order to stop those interest rates, especially the long-term interest rates, from spiking, in order to make sure that your government and corporations don't become insolvent because they can't roll over their debt to an interest rate that they can afford.
Fantastic. And how would it play out exactly? Like now, if tomorrow the Fed starts yield curve control?
It would well, if they did it tomorrow, that would be it would look like business as usual. You'd probably see this be employed as a measure to mitigate some sort of crisis. So I've been talking about the Evergrande situation, and I don't think that will unfold as catastrophically as it looked like it might have in the beginning. But let's just say, for imagination purposes, it does spark some kind of a massive catastrophe. China's GDP collapses by 30, 40, 50%. They completely stop all spending. The second biggest economy in the world. And so that has knock-on effects everywhere. And so you start to see a global slowdown as a result of that. And contagion starts spreading, whatever. If they step in then, well, number one, a lot of treasuries would start getting sold off. And so they step in and they open up all of their new their facilities that they opened up last year to make sure that anybody who wants to sell treasuries can sell directly to the Federal Reserve so that they don't have to sell them at market rates to each other. Because if everybody's trying to sell them, the few buyers are going to be able to demand a very high interest rate. They're going to be buying them at a very low price. And so the Federal Reserve will open their doors and say, don't sell to each other, sell to us because we're going to buy them at full pop. And so that's what it looks like in the beginning for yield curve control. And then it morphs into more of just a solidified policy of yield curve control if they become the primary holders of that debt following everybody selling that off. And along with that is the selling of dollars, because a treasury is just a dollar that pays you interest. So if you don't want treasuries, you definitely don't want dollars. And so after they get rid of treasuries, the rest of the world would get rid of dollars. And if everybody's trying to get rid of dollars, where are you going to give those dollars to? You're not going to give them to Germany. You're not going to give them to France. The only place you're going to be able to get those dollars to is a place where people are legally required to still take dollars. And what are they required to take those dollars for? Not just for nothing. And Americans don't have any foreign currency. Our foreign currency reserves are, zero, not zero, but very low compared to the rest of the world. You can look up our NIIP, net investment something position, and it's very low compared to the rest of the world. And so the only way that those dollars can get returned back to the States is in exchange for dollar denominated stuff like stocks, real estate, and inventory, companies' inventory. So for 30 years, 40 years, we've been shipping dollars around the world, and the rest of the world has been happy to accept them. At some point, those dollars will come back, and all of that money that we've printed will come back and bid up those prices that have been delayed by buying our assets, buying our properties, buying the stuff off of our shelves, and we'll experience the shortage and the high prices that we would have experienced if we would have been a different country that wasn't the global reserve currency doing this monetary policy all along.
All right. Yeah. Well, talking about, because this is all possibly introduced by the Fed at some moment, and they've been talking about tapering. And even though they've been talking about tapering, they haven't done it. They've been talking about it ever since they started QE, of course. First of all, can they taper? And what would you conclude if they can't?
Well, they'll certainly try. I don't think they can maintain their credibility without at least starting an asset purchase taper. And the only way that they can maintain their credibility without starting an asset purchase taper is if a new crisis unfolds before they actually start. So should some major banks suddenly announce that they're completely insolvent, HSBC, tomorrow shuts down, that would have knock-on effects for the financial plumbing of the entire world. And so something like that happens, then they get to avoid an asset purchase taper. I don't think they'll get to avoid starting an asset purchase taper. What I do think will happen is within the next 6 months or so, they start tapering their asset purchases. This is different than the taper of, a couple of years ago, where they were reducing the size of their balance sheet. That's them selling assets. Right now, they're buying $120 billion worth of assets every single month. And so they might take that down to, that's at least 120 billion. So they might take that down to a maximum of 120 billion. And then they might take it down to 100 billion. And the result of that will likely be a big fall in asset prices broadly.
A taper tantrum.
Yes. Yeah. And so as a result of that, you'll likely see some things that they'll be able to say threaten stability of the financial system, and they'll reverse course. Just like everybody was saying, hey, they're only raising rates so that they can lower rates during the next recession. Similar type of thing. They have to at least show that they're backing up the lip service they've been giving to tapering, so that when it does eventually cause the next kind of collapse, then they have the ability to come in, and purchase, $500 billion a month or whatever it is.